The next topic that I'll be speaking about is going to be managing your application. And what this means is when something is not going as planned, how do you troubleshoot that? Where do you look and what do you do? And finally, how would you control some of the details about budgeting your application? With troubleshooting, we'll discuss the system status page and how to use the admin console. There's a lot of information about the quota, how you would set it, how you'd use it. And then lastly, we'll discuss how and why you'd enable billing. And once your billing is enabled, how you'd set the different budgets for your application. We'll also touch a little on how this relates and the differences between a Premier account and a standard online build application. So if something stopped in your legacy environment, you could actually log into your server and see a lot of details. The operating system, the app, how it's running, what it's doing. But in the cloud, you lose a little bit of control. We still provide a lot of tools that we give you so that you can troubleshoot your application and identify where those problems are. But there's a different way of thinking about things. If nothing else, you could be sitting in any data center. If you think about a traditional environment, having to aggregate those logs and present them in one common format, it would be very challenging. And so, what we strive very hard to do is to keep it simple, so that you can leverage the power of our infrastructure without having to worry about tweaking a lot of knobs. So now, I'd like to talk a little bit about where you look when problems do arise. If your application is returning errors in every request, the first thing you want to do is check a few things. The first is your application actually running? Did you have a different version deployed? Is the default version the right version that you have? But then you would very quickly look to see if you have any errors in your log. We aggregate all the logs on the admin page for every request. In fact, we even keep track of a lot of the requests that are served out of our edge caching infrastructure. Obviously, those won't be any of the source of dynamic errors, and we present that all in a near real-time information. If App Engine itself is down, we also have the Google App Engine Notify groups. Your application at any one time is currently only served out of a single data center. We do that for latency reasons. One is that if you're using Cloud SQL, for example, we want to make sure that it's in the same data center, but that all the ancillary services are living with your application. And we fail over very seamlessly between data centers. But the important thing to note is that your application is currently only running in one data center at a time. So when you're troubleshooting things, you don't have to worry about different data centers to look at. App Engine could possibly be down in one data center, and all the applications could be served over in a different data center very quickly. The Google App Engine Downtime Notify tells you if there's a system-wide issue. You also see our status dashboard, which shows aggregated metrics from apps that we have running in different data centers. We're trying to give you a snapshot of what's different at our infrastructure. And you can see in your individual application, it might be different. Here's what the App Engine admin console looks like. And this will tell you a lot of information. Just simply, is your application serving? How many different instances it has running? And the average query per second, or QPS. It's great. It's what I always look at first when I'm trying to troubleshoot a problem. And what you'll see very quickly is if you've run out of quota, it's going to actually show you the quota that you've run out of. And if there's additional quotas that aren't shown on the dashboard page that you've run into, it will actually add them to the bottom of the screen and show a little exclamation mark notifying you that you've hit some errors there. Perhaps the most important page is that dashboard. The next one was instances discussed earlier. And thirdly is the logs. There's a lot of great information in those logs that cover what your application is doing, who accessed the application and from which IP. If the instance is still running, then you can also see inside that log a link straight to the logs for that instance. So now, if you see an error that's happening, you can very quickly see what's causing the problem. And just like in a traditional environment running in individual machines, it's not unheard of for an individual machine to actually have problems. We see that from time to time. And we try to catch all those challenges or those bugs on our side, and not even letting us deploy application. And that's how we use the App Master to coordinate which servers are currently hosting applications in our environment. But in some cases, there might be corrupt memory. There might be something wrong with that local disk drive, and your application may be spinning some errors. And if you see a lot of errors from one instance, you can shut down that instance and it will spin a new instance up on a different machine. Now that's very rare, but it may happen. And so it's something to look into. If you see this a lot, or if you notice it, we'd appreciate it if you could open a support ticket so that we could identify which ones were causing errors and why it caused errors that our system didn't catch, so that we can improve the server so it doesn't slip through the cracks. So let's discuss the logs. Whenever you experience those tech issues, obviously there's going to be a lot of information in the logs. We store a free 1 gigabyte of data and a timeline of 90 days. If you want to store more or longer, we just charge you at 24 cents per gigabyte per month. And you can use APIs to pull those logs and keep them on a separate system. A lot of companies copy their logs over to Google Cloud Storage for our long-term storage, where you can do some transformation, import them into BigQuery, and do some analytics across them. In addition to just the simple logs, you can do a system.out to write to the logs if you specify that the log handler should be at a level info or lower, meaning info debugging. Otherwise, you can also write straight to the log with a normal logging mechanism. But since we do charge for that storage, I would recommend against storing a lot of information for all your production applications. It might make sense to do some testing and then lower the log, just for the same reason you do that in a local environment. Now, when you look at the logs, there's a few things to keep in mind. We do present the millisecond response time, the CPU response time also in milliseconds, and then the cost. We touch more on how you'd estimate those costs later, but this gives you a relative indicator. So if you're trying two different functions out, you could see if one ends up costing more. That means that it spends more time processing it and therefore is more expensive, whether or not it may have been faster for a variety of different reasons. Perhaps you're doing API requests to other libraries or a URL fetch that could have added a lot of delay but doesn't actually require compute processing power. What do you think is one of the most common issues we see across the board? What most people do is launch their app and they think they could scale infinitely, but they forgot to enable billing, and they wonder why it stops working after a certain amount of requests. We have a whole quota system, and there's good reason why. It's not just for the billing purpose, but since we have a shared infrastructure, we want to make sure that everybody has enough room to grow and play. And so we have some built-in quotas that you can consume against. This would be things such as incoming and outgoing bandwidth, the data store usage, the different amounts of mail that you could send. But we also have others, like the static code that you've stored. In fact, if you look at the quota detail page, there's a huge list of different things we have quotas for. A quota exceeded error is just simply that you've run out of a quota in one of these buckets when you've tried to perform the operation. So it's entirely possible that you have a lot of quota left over for actually running the application. For example, perhaps this task queue you've hit 100,000 times and you've hit the quota limit for it. So the task queue starts throwing errors. So you might think that something's wrong in the infrastructure. It takes you a while to finally realize that you've just run out of task queue quota. It would have been very simple if you went to the dashboard, but then maybe they went straight to the logs. Start digging. That's why you want to look at the dashboard first before the logs. So we have a couple of different types of quotas which could be confusing to new developers in the cloud platform. We have two different types. We have a daily quota, where I think of it as a bunch of tokens in a bucket, and every time you perform a task, it pulls a token from that bucket. And if you run out over the period of the day, then you run out. You have to wait for the next reset period, which happens at 10 a.m. Pacific time. We also have a per minute quota, And the reason why we do this is we don't want one app to drain all the resources in a data center. Believe it or not, that's entirely possible. We use the same infrastructure for our web crawler that we use for the URL fetch. So we put these quotas on there so that you can't consume too fast in 1 minute. The same as the concept as the daily token or the daily bucket is we have a bucket for each minute that we keep throwing tokens in every single minute. And then you pull from that. And if you run out in a minute, you just have to wait for that minute to finish to replenish that bucket. And then you continue processing. Now we have usually 2 different limits. We have one limit for free apps and a different limit for billed apps. Once you enable billing, we have your credit card, we know who you are, so we trust you a little more. And we know who to knock on the door, so to speak, if something goes wrong, or a card that we can charge. So that's why you'll see 2 different limits. But almost all the limits that we have are completely soft limits. And so if there's an application that, for example, needs to open 1 million channel calls in a minute because you have a huge site that a lot of people are going to connect to, we can handle that. Just you need to talk to us so that we can understand what you're trying to do. And when you're doing it at that scale, a lot of times we might ask a few questions to make sure that you're doing it appropriately and not trying to do something kind of abusive. Or maybe there's a better way to do it that we can talk to you. The way you would open those or talk to us would be typically through a Premier support, opening a ticket through that. And so I can't stress enough that I keep mentioning you would want to open a ticket or you'd want to talk to us. The best way to do that is by having a Premier account. If you guys don't have a Premier account, I recommend doing it, getting through the process of getting that set up so you can submit tickets and our team can interact with you very efficiently. One additional suggestion, you can specify your application either single thread or multi-thread. If your code could handle multiple threads, obviously it's much more efficient to do that. Otherwise, your single instance can only respond to one request at a time. Ultimately, it tends to cost less for a multi-threaded application. So let's talk about quotas for incoming and outgoing bandwidth. And this is just one example from our documentation. As I mentioned, we have lots of quotas, and so you have to go online to see all of them. But here's where we could specify if we have outgoing bandwidths for the free limit and them for billing enabled. So you'll see that daily limit go from 1 gigabyte to 14 terabytes. Just a small jump. But also from 56 megs a minute to 10 gigs a minute. So we actually, even once you've enabled billing, we already have a pretty high quota. We just need to talk to support and see how you can do that. And by the way, if you plan on launching on Monday, don't open a ticket on Friday night. Give us at least a week at a minimum. The longer you give us, the better, because it sometimes has to involve engineering. And they actually sometimes have to change code because if we're going over a big spike, we'll create a whole new bucket system for maybe just your app. So again, free incoming bandwidth, same thing. Since we don't have the same abuse issues for incoming bandwidth, meaning as we would for outgoing, we've obviously higher limits. And a lot of things too is from an infrastructure perspective. We have more data going out than we do in. So it's a lot easier for us to say, sure, go ahead and send it since our pipes are bidirectional. So here's the details page for quotas. And this is where it lists a huge variety of quotas that we have. And there's many more that aren't even shown here that we can see internally, just so it doesn't confuse you as well as tell us more about our infrastructure. But this should give you a good snapshot of where you are in your quota. What this shows is the daily quota, and typically will show you the free, and a lot of times you'll see the free consumption here, and it will show red. But that just means that you start paying for that, and there'll maybe be another entry later that says, but your larger quota may be greater. Know that this may slightly differ between the online billing and a Premier enabled account. So how would you handle these quota errors that you get? But you can also catch these exceptions as they happen. So for example, if your application still works fine, but your task queue runs out of quota, you could handle that gracefully. And the way you do that is in Java, we throw over quota exceptions. Or in Python, we give it an over quota error. So you're always going to want to check it in your application when you run into this. If you're using the task queue, for example, it may throw an error, which you'll just put it back in the task queue and we'll retry later. So maybe that's an acceptable thing to just simply let throw a non-success code for the HTTP request. But just keep in mind of the cost benefit of it. Is it really worth doing all this capturing of errors in order to provide the experience I want? So you've hit quota errors. Like I talked about earlier, if you haven't enabled billing, you're going to have lower quotas. So the first thing you want to do is enable billing. Then you can set a budget on the different resources. Something to consider, though, is you don't have the ability to set maximum charges on your application. If you have a new developer in your team that launches a task queue with an endless loop that spins up a lot of instances, for example, you're going to pay for that, and there's no way to stop that. I've seen a lot of customers do development on online apps, and most of development can be free if they don't hit the quotas. Their only production applications are in their Premier account. That's certainly a way of addressing it. So when I talk about setting a budget, that doesn't just apply to Premier accounts. So you'd enable the billing by going to the admin console, and then the billing status, and then just enable billing. And when you do that, it actually uses our Google Wallet now to get your credit card information and start billing you. So you'll have to have a Google Wallet account in order to do this. And we'll charge the credit card. But what's nice is if you go to Wallet, you can also see the past invoices as well as on the app console. You'll see all the information there. All the different usage we have has corresponding dollar amounts with it. And once you enable billing, you still get all your free quotas. And we only start charging you once you go beyond that free quota. Also worth noting is that if you have billing enabled, we'll charge you a minimum of $2.10 a week. And any usage that your app has will be subtracted from that. So for example, if you have $5 in usage, you only pay $5 because that's more than $2.10. If you have 0 usage for that week, you'll still be charged $2.10. And once you enable billing, it's just over in our system, making sure that it's serious. And there's also abuse vectors inside here. So for example, once you enable billing, we wait until a certain number of our charges is cleared so that we know that the credit card is valid before we allow you to send a large number of emails. We've noticed by doing that, it cut down significantly on spammers using our system to send email. So there's also reasons for that. And that's part of the $2.10. Frankly, we're not getting rich off of the $2.10. It's just to gate people that aren't serious about this and would commit fraud from actually enabling billing. If you have more than 1 gig in your logs, for example, you have to enable billing in order to do that. You also have certain features like the minimum max idle instances, I think, might be something you'd need billing enabled for. There's some tweaks like that when you go into your app, if it doesn't work exactly the way your production app does, it might be because the billing is not enabled. Now for the front-end instance hours. This is confusing to some people because of the invoices in the billing. We only charge instant hours. We don't charge instance sizes. And the way we do that is every multiple. What you can do then, once you've enabled billing, is you can set a daily max budget. And that's very helpful for situations where you have an endless loop or a mistake, or you accidentally started writing billions of objects to the data store. Then you have to go back and delete all those. The way to prevent that from running out of control is to set the max daily budget. And we can also specify discounted instance hours. It lets us do better capacity planning because you'd set this for your application. And that pretty much means you're going to consume however many instance hours per week. Or you're going to pay us that regardless. Or if not, you use it. So that allows us to ramp up our capacity to meet the demands that's planned. And we pass on some cost savings. So rather than the 8 cents per hour, we're only going to charge you 5 cents per hour. This means that if you put in 500 instance hours here, that means your app will consume 500 hours over the course of a week. And so every hour that's consumed, we take from that bucket. And as soon as you've depleted that bucket, we just continue serving the application. But at the 8 cents per hour rate, not the discounted 5 cents per instance hour, for example. Now, since we don't have the ability to set this information for Premier accounts, all instances are a charge of 5 cents per instance hour for Premier accounts. So another great reason to get a Premier account, not only you get the support, the SLA, but you also get the discount on all your front-end consumption. Another thing that I've seen people run into is they enable billing because they run out of quota. It may take some time for our system to process it, so you can expect a 15 to 20 minute delay from when you enable billing to actually getting the benefits. And in some cases, like that email, we don't actually increase the quota until we've cleared at least one charge. Finally, here's a list of resources, both documents and articles that you might be interested in pursuing further information on managing your app.